Friday evenings in the Dawson household followed a rhythm that had not changed in years. By the time the sky over Portland dimmed to a soft gray blue, the kitchen was already warm with familiar sounds and smells. Claire moved calmly between the counter and the stove, checking the oven, adjusting a pan, wiping her hands on a folded towel. She was making Andrew's favorite meal, the one she had prepared almost every Friday since Lily was small. Nothing about the evening felt unusual. At the dining table, Lily set the plates with practiced ease. She aligned the cutlery carefully, nudged a glass into place, and checked her phone only once before slipping it into her pocket. This routine was as ingrained as the house itself. Dinner on Fridays meant everyone was home. It meant conversation, small complaints, and the quiet sense that things were exactly where they belonged. Andrew arrived a few minutes later than usual. The moment he stepped inside, Claire noticed the tension in his posture. He wore a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, the kind he used when he had already rehearsed something important. He greeted them, washed his hands, and sat down, his movements deliberate, almost formal. As they began to eat, Andrew waited only a moment before clearing his throat. His tone was controlled, measured. He said that starting this month, the household would be moving to a separated budget. He explained it as a practical decision, something he had thought through carefully. According to him, it was about fairness, about individual responsibility, about each person managing what they earned. He went on, outlining the details as if presenting a plan at work. Claire, he said, did not have a job. Because of that, he would give her a fixed monthly amount to cover household needs. The rest of his income, he explained, he would manage himself. Lily stopped eating. She said nothing, but her eyes lifted briefly from her plate to her father's face, then to her mother's. Claire listened without interrupting. When Andrew finished, she paused only long enough to swallow her food. Then she looked up and said, evenly and without emotion that she understood. She agreed. No questions, no objections, no visible reaction at all. Andrew blinked, momentarily thrown off. He had expected resistance. Tears, perhaps. An argument. Instead, the conversation drifted back to neutral topics, as if nothing had changed. As the meal continued, Andrew felt a growing unease settle in his chest. Claire's calm did not reassure him. It unsettled him. Something had shifted, even if he could not yet name it. Dinner continued, strangely intact. The clink of cutlery returned, soft and familiar, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the pauses between bites. Claire reached for the serving spoon, asked Lily about a quiz she had taken that week, and listened with the same attentiveness she always did. Her tone was steady, her posture relaxed, as if the announcement that had just been made belonged to another evening entirely. Andrew waited. He ate more slowly now, watching for something, an edge in Claire's voice, a delayed question, a sudden change in her expression. He had learned over the years that reactions did not always arrive immediately. Sometimes they came later, once the shock wore off, but nothing followed. Claire nodded at Lily's answers, offered a brief comment about an upcoming school project, and poured herself another glass of water. Lily, for her part, was unusually quiet. She did not argue or ask questions, but her attention had sharpened. She glanced at her father once, then back to her plate, her fork tracing absent-minded lines through the food. It was not defiance exactly. It was observation. The calm began to feel deliberate. Andrew shifted in his chair, trying to convince himself that this was a good sign. Claire was being reasonable, mature. This, he told himself, was proof that his decision had been correct. There was no need for conflict if everyone understood their place. He straightened slightly, reassured by the thought that control, once established, did not need to be defended. Across the table, Claire listened to Lily speak and responded at the right moments, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had imagined this conversation long before it happened. Not the words themselves, but the moment, the shift. She had known, quietly and without drama, that it would come one day. And she had prepared for it, piece by piece, year after year, without ever announcing her readiness. When the plates were nearly empty, Andrew cleared his throat again, half expecting Claire to stop him. To return to the topic, she did not. She simply stood, collected the dishes, and carried them to the sink. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was restrained, and beneath it something waited. Monday morning arrived with the same gray light filtering through the kitchen windows. But the routine Andrew relied on fractured almost immediately. He moved through the house on autopilot, reaching for his mug, opening the cabinet where his coffee had always been. His hand paused. The shelf was empty. Andrew frowned and checked again, pushing aside the tea Claire preferred, then the box of filters. The expensive Italian blend he drank every morning, strong, dark, familiar, was nowhere to be found. He felt a small, sharp irritation rise in his chest. "Claire," he called, his voice carrying toward the bedroom. She answered from down the hall, already dressed. When he asked about the coffee, her reply came calmly without hesitation. She said she had not bought it. She reminded him that they now had separate budgets, and that his coffee was not something she could justify purchasing anymore. It was too expensive. There was no edge in her voice, no hint of spite. She spoke the way someone might explain a line item on a spreadsheet. Andrew stood still, mug in hand, unsure how to respond. The explanation felt oddly final. He muttered something about picking it up himself on the way to work, trying to sound unfazed. Claire did not comment. She passed through the kitchen a moment later, tying her hair back, a gym bag over her shoulder. She mentioned Pilates, the class she had recently resumed. Her schedule sounded settled, intentional. She poured herself a glass of water, checked her phone, and headed for the door. Before leaving, she gave Andrew a brief, polite look, as if to confirm that everything had been said. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. Andrew stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty shelf. It was a small thing, he told himself, hardly worth noting. He grabbed a cheaper substitute from the back of the cabinet, brewed it quickly, and took a sip. The taste was wrong, thinner, unsatisfying. As he set the mug down, a strange awareness settled over him. This was not an argument. It was not a fight he could win by pushing harder. It was simply the result of a rule he had introduced, now applied without exception. For the first time, the decision felt real. By the middle of the week, the separation Andrew had announced began to take shape in ways he had not anticipated. When he opened the refrigerator one evening, he stopped short. The shelves were no longer shared. Clear lines had been drawn, containers grouped neatly on the left, others on the right. Small labels marked the division. Claire and Lily's food occupied one side. The other was his. At first, Andrew assumed it was temporary, but the pattern held. Groceries appeared regularly, just not for him. Fresh produce, prepared meals, and snacks filled Claire and Lily's section, while his side remained sparse unless he stocked it himself. Claire did not explain unless asked, and when she did, her answer was always the same. She was simply following the agreement they now had. The changes extended beyond the kitchen. One morning, Andrew reached for his shampoo and found the bottle empty. A day later, the shaving gel was gone. Each time, he waited for replacements that never appeared. When he mentioned it in passing, Claire reminded him, evenly, that personal items were no longer shared expenses. By Thursday, the fuel gauge in his car hovered just above empty. He realized he had been driving on habit, not awareness. Filling the tank felt oddly irritating, not because of the cost alone, but because it had once been something he never had to think about. Now it was another task added quietly to his list. The first utility notice arrived that evening. Internet, electricity, streaming subscriptions. Andrew saw his name printed clearly on the statements. He had never paid attention to whose account they were under. Claire had always managed it. When he questioned her, she answered without defensiveness. The accounts had always been his. She had simply handled the logistics when they shared finances. Lily adjusted without comment. She packed lunches with her mother's groceries, poured herself cereal from the left side of the fridge, and asked Claire about plans the two of them had made. There was no rebellion in her behavior, no pointed remarks. She was not choosing sides. She was following the structure that now existed. Andrew began to feel the absence of things he had never counted as effort. Meals, supplies, organization. The house still functioned, but differently. It no longer compensated for him. And each time he noticed the gap, Claire responded with the same calm reminder. This was what separated budgets looked like. By Friday, the strain reached beyond the house. Andrew's workday unraveled almost from the moment it began. Traffic crawled along the freeway longer than usual, each red light adding to his irritation. A meeting he had counted on ended without results. By midday, a deal he had been confident about quietly collapsed, followed by a last-minute cancellation from a client who had suddenly decided to postpone. He told himself it was coincidence, a bad day, nothing more. Still, as the hours dragged on, Andrew found himself checking his phone more often, not for emails but for numbers. He opened his banking app while waiting in the parking lot, scrolling through recent charges, gas, coffee he had bought on the way in, a lunch he barely had time to eat. The balance looked smaller than he expected. He recalculated, then recalculated again. By late afternoon, hunger set in. He considered ordering dinner, something quick and comforting. He opened a delivery app, scanned the options, and paused. The prices felt steeper than he remembered. Delivery fees, service charges, tips. He closed the app, opened it again, then checked his account once more. After a full tank of gas and a few unplanned expenses, the margin he usually ignored suddenly mattered. With a tired sigh, he decided to eat at home. The moment he opened the front door, the smell hit him. Warm, rich, unmistakable. Something baked, fresh from the oven. His stomach tightened with hunger. For a second, relief flickered, automatic, instinctive. Then he walked into the kitchen. On the table sat a tray of golden pastries, still steaming slightly. Beside it was a folded note. Andrew picked it up and read the short message. It was simple, almost polite. This food was for Claire and Lily. His items were in his section of the refrigerator. He opened the fridge, already knowing what he would find. On his side there was very little. A half-eaten sandwich from the day before. A bottle of ketchup. Nothing else. Lily entered the kitchen with a mug of tea, pausing when she saw him standing there. She didn't argue or apologize. She reminded him, calmly, that this was how things were now. He had wanted separate finances. As she left, the lights flickered once, then went out. A moment later, a notification appeared on Andrew's phone. Internet service interrupted due to unpaid billing. Andrew sat down at the table, the kitchen dim and quiet around him. From down the hall, he could hear Lily laughing softly on her phone, music playing from Claire's room. Life continued, just not around him. For the first time since his announcement, Andrew felt truly alone. By the weekend, Andrew could no longer ignore the pressure building around him. The house still moved on its familiar schedule, but he felt like a guest inside it, someone navigating rules he had created without fully understanding their cost. On Sunday morning, he found Claire in the living room, scrolling through her tablet, a cup of tea cooling beside her. "Can we talk about the budget?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Claire looked up at him without surprise. She nodded once and said yes, as if she had been expecting the question. She mentioned, almost casually, that she had already put together a detailed expense plan. The way she said it, prepared, unhurried, made Andrew pause. They sat at the table, facing each other. Claire opened the document on her tablet and turned it so he could see. Columns of numbers filled the screen. Groceries, utilities, transportation, subscriptions, clothing, small, ordinary expenses Andrew had never thought to list because they had always been handled before he noticed their absence. Claire explained quietly that budgeting did not create problems. It revealed them. When everything was shared, it was easy to miss how much effort went into keeping life smooth. Once finances were separated, the structure became visible. So did the gaps. Andrew listened, his eyes moving from one line to the next. He began to recognize patterns, how often certain purchases repeated, how quickly small costs accumulated. He remembered reaching into a full refrigerator without thinking, stepping into a car that was always fueled, opening apps that never seemed to fail. None of it had felt like support at the time. It had felt automatic. Now it did not. I didn't realize, he started, then stopped. The words felt insufficient. Claire did not interrupt or correct him. She simply waited, hands folded loosely in front of her. The distance between them was subtle but unmistakable. They were speaking calmly, respectfully, yet something essential had shifted. Claire was no longer explaining herself. She was explaining a system. Andrew was no longer making decisions. He was reacting to them. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time, he could see that this conversation was not about money alone. It was about awareness, about how much of their shared life he had accepted without acknowledgement. The realization had begun, but control had not returned to him. Andrew broke the silence first. His voice was lower now, careful. He asked how Claire had managed so precisely, how she seemed so ready the moment he announced a change. The question hung between them, no longer defensive, but searching. Claire did not answer immediately. She reached into the drawer beside her chair and took out a slim folder. The motion was unhurried, deliberate. When she placed it on the table and opened it, Andrew saw neatly organized documents inside. Bank statements, account summaries, dates stretching back years. She told him she had been preparing quietly for a long time. At first, she explained, it had been small. She set aside modest amounts from the household money he gave her. Nothing that disrupted their life, nothing noticeable. She treated it as a precaution, a habit formed after a conversation she once had with a relative who warned her never to be entirely dependent on someone else. At the time, she had not thought she would ever need it. Then she began earning her own income. It started as a hobby. Handmade items she created in the evenings after Lily went to bed. She sold a few pieces online, mostly to see if anyone would buy them. When they did, she reinvested what she earned. Slowly, carefully, without announcement. Over time, the orders became more regular. She learned how to manage listings, shipping, customer messages. What had begun as something private and tentative grew into something structured. 3 years earlier, she formalized it. She opened a dedicated business account, registered her store properly, tracked her income, paid taxes. The store expanded beyond one platform. The numbers increased, not dramatically but steadily, enough to matter. Claire slid a page toward Andrew. The figures were clear. Her monthly income was not far from his. Andrew stared at the page, his expression tightening. He had never asked, never suspected. He had assumed her days revolved entirely around the house, around Lily, around him. He had mistaken silence for absence. Lily entered the room quietly and stopped when she saw the papers spread across the table. Claire did not shield her from the conversation. Instead, she explained calmly that Lily knew. She had taught her daughter about saving, budgeting, and planning. Lily had her own account, her own small investments, her own goals. Not as rebellion, but as preparation. Andrew felt the weight of it settle fully then. The structure he believed he had controlled, the finances, the stability, the direction of their family, had never rested solely in his hands. It had been supported, managed, and quietly reinforced by work he had not seen because he had not looked. Claire closed the folder and met his eyes. There was no accusation in her expression, only certainty. This was the moment Andrew understood. The separation had not stripped him of power. It had revealed that the power he believed was his had always been shared, only he had never acknowledged it. The balance of the story shifted there, without drama, without raised voices. Just truth, laid plainly on the table. Andrew sat back in his chair, his hands resting flat on the table. The documents still spread between them. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter than before. He asked why she had never said anything, why she had never corrected him, never pushed back, never made her position clear over all those years. Claire considered the question carefully. Then she answered without hesitation. She said that control often survived on illusion. As long as life ran smoothly, there was no reason to challenge who believed they were in charge. It had been convenient for both of them. Andrew felt secure in his role. She ensured stability without conflict. The system worked not because it was fair, but because it was unexamined. She explained that she had not stayed silent out of fear or submission. She had stayed silent because there had been no opening that required the truth. As long as finances were shared and decisions appeared mutual, there was no reason to expose the imbalance beneath them. Doing so would have changed nothing. It would only have created tension where none was acknowledged. The separation, she said, had not created a problem. It had exposed one. Claire leaned forward slightly, her tone still even. By dividing the budget, Andrew had forced every invisible contribution into the open. The effort, the planning, the management, things that had once blended into the background, were suddenly visible because they were no longer freely available. What he was experiencing now was not punishment, it was clarity. Andrew listened without interrupting. The words landed with weight, not because they were sharp, but because they were precise. Claire told him that she did not want to return to the way things had been, not to a structure built on assumption and unspoken dependence. If they were to continue as a couple, it would have to be different, transparent, balanced, based on equal footing, not roles that existed simply because they had never been questioned. She proposed renegotiating their marriage the same way one would renegotiate any serious partnership, openly, with clear expectations, with shared authority rather than inherited control. Andrew felt something shift in that moment. Not anger, not defeat, recognition. The authority he had once assumed no longer applied. What remained, what might still be built, would have to be earned. And for the first time, he understood that this was not a loss. It was a reckoning. 3 weeks later, the house felt quieter, but not tense. The shift had settled into something steadier, something deliberate. On a Sunday afternoon, Andrew sat at the kitchen table with a printed financial plan spread out in front of him. 2 columns ran down the page, aligned carefully, equal contributions, shared responsibilities, clear boundaries. It was unfamiliar, and yet it made sense. Claire stood nearby, sorting groceries into the refrigerator. When Andrew suggested reorganizing the kitchen entirely, she shook her head. Some things, she said, would stay. The old clock above the doorway, the one that had belonged to her grandmother, remained where it was. The worn cutting board she used every day stayed on the counter. These items were not about ownership or money. They were markers of continuity. Change did not require erasure. Andrew nodded and did not argue. Lily entered the kitchen moments later, holding a notebook filled with handwritten numbers and notes. She spoke with an ease Andrew had not seen before, explaining that one of her early investments had increased in value, not dramatically, but enough to encourage her. She talked about saving for a summer course she wanted to take, about learning more, about planning ahead. Andrew listened. He did not interrupt or smile indulgently the way he might have in the past. He asked questions instead. How had she chosen the investment? What risks had she considered? Lily's eyes lit up as she answered, surprised but pleased by his interest. Claire watched quietly from the counter. As the conversation continued, Andrew realized how much he had missed by assuming rather than engaging. Lily was not experimenting blindly. She was applying lessons she had been taught carefully and early. The confidence in her voice was not accidental. It had been cultivated. Later, when the kitchen emptied and the house returned to its low, familiar sounds, Andrew remained at the table. He studied the numbers again, not with resistance, but with attention. This arrangement did not elevate him. It did not diminish Claire. It balanced them. There was no sense of victory in the room, no satisfaction drawn from anyone else's discomfort. The resolution did not announce itself loudly. It simply existed, firm and unremarkable, like a structure that had finally been built on a stable foundation. For the first time in weeks, Andrew felt neither in charge nor excluded. He felt included because he was finally paying attention. The suggestion came without ceremony. One evening, as Claire unloaded a small bag of supplies onto the counter, she mentioned that the business was growing again. Orders had increased steadily over the past few months. She said she was considering expanding cautiously, and then added that Andrew might want to be involved. He looked up, unsure he had heard correctly. Claire explained what she meant with the same calm precision she had used throughout everything else. If he joined her, it would be as an equal partner. Decisions would be shared. Authority would be mutual. There would be no assumptions, no unspoken hierarchies, no roles inherited by habit alone. Respect, she said, would not be implied. It would be practiced. Andrew did not respond immediately. He studied her face, searching for irony or challenge, and found none. This was not an offer extended out of obligation or forgiveness. It was practical, considered, conditional. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. He admitted that he had been blind for a long time. Not maliciously, he said, but comfortably. He had confused responsibility with control, provision with authority. He had believed that managing money meant managing people, and he understood now how narrow that view had been. Accepting the shift did not feel like surrender. It felt like alignment. Claire nodded once, acknowledging his answer without celebration. The matter in her eyes was settled. Later that night, the house grew quiet again. The familiar clock ticked softly in the hallway. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and steady. Inside, nothing dramatic had changed. There were no raised voices, no final declarations, no reckoning delivered with force. What had changed was quieter than that. The balance of the household no longer rested on who controlled the resources, but on how they were shared. Strength was no longer measured by dominance or command, but by awareness and cooperation. The transformation did not demand recognition. It simply took its place, firm and lasting. And in that quiet equilibrium, dignity was restored, not through victory but through balance.